Good day, everybody. This is Kevin Hogan, your author of 22 books, now translated into 41 languages around the world. I saw Invisible Influence just got published in Poland this week. Happy to see that. Today, bypassing critical thinking, bypassing the critical factor of the mind so you can have hypnotic storytelling that generates narrative transportation, that creates persuasion and influence when you're telling your story, that getting messages across that you otherwise would have had to use through argumentation. So we want to do all this with story. It was a cold 1998 winter's night, January, in Burnsville, Minnesota, and I was teaching at the high school that night, scheduled to teach at the high school that night, for nine adults who were coming in for community education to learn about the psychology of persuasion. The class was from 6 to 9:30, and I was like just about 2 hours away from making a decision as to what I should do on this day. It's snowing, and by the time we get to starting the class, it could be as much as a foot of snow on the ground. Now, a foot of snow is not terrifying in Minnesota, but still it clogs up the roads, it closes some roads, it makes traffic very hazardous and unwise, generally speaking. So I had a decision. I was like, okay, I've got 9 people scheduled for tonight. I don't know if we should really do this. 9 people isn't enough anyway. I mean, these people are paying $35 a piece to come see the Psychology of Persuasion that night. They don't know who I am. They don't know the book, The Psychology of Persuasion. And if we canceled, we would disappoint 9 people. But then I thought, gosh, if we cancel, we might actually have people who still get there because it's only 2.5 hours till showtime. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon right now. And if I cancel, what if some people show up and they get to the school, and on the front door of the school, the only event, canceled, or the last event canceled, is mine? And I thought, oh, that would be not cool. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go. And I went. It took me a good 15-20 minutes to get there in the snow, and it was only about 4 miles from my house, so it was pretty bad that night. And I got there and I set up, and I didn't know if anybody was going to come. Well, after about 15-20 minutes, everybody was late, but there were 5 people that showed up. There were 5 people, and they all sat right in the middle, right across the center. It was really interesting. And so we went through and we did the regular class, The Psychology of Persuasion, 3.5 hours. Had a good time with the 5 people. At the end of the night, one of the guys, Mike Fedock, really good guy, came up and said, hey, Kev, you're pretty good. We'd like to look at you at the University of St. Thomas, up the management center. Is that something you might be interested in talking about? And I said, are you kidding? I go, I can't even spell University of St. Thomas Management Center. Yeah, absolutely. I would love to do that. When could we talk about it? And he says, how about we go out to eat tonight? Well, we got a foot of snow and more out there. And I thought, well, sure, let's go. And it turns out there was a Baker's Square that was open. Everything else was closed. And so we went in there, and the place was silent. And he said, you know what? He says, you should come down there to the management center. He says, I'll get you some of the interviews to make sure that everybody's on board with bringing you on. But we'd love to have you. And I was like, wow, that's like a break. That's like what happens in Hollywood. Going to the University of St. Thomas Management Center is like a big place to train and teach at. So I was ecstatic. And what I did next, of course, was I interviewed with St. Thomas, and I got on there. And that's what opened the doors when people would come and see me there. That Cargill, not the CEO, but the management staff of Cargill would be there, or at 3M, and they would come in for trainings, and then I would then eventually go to their corporations and do trainings, not for a lot of money, for maybe $2,000 for a day, but nevertheless, that was way more than I was getting paid then, because that night at the Burnsville High School, I made $147, I believe it was, and I signed 5 copies of The Psychology of Persuasion, which I had bought and then gave away to everybody just to have an autographed copy of the book. So now I'm going to stop right here in our story. Bypassing critical thinking. Did we bypass critical thought? Because I had a lot of messages that I wanted to get through to you. So did those messages get through? What messages did we get through? First of all, Kevin wrote a book. That's a good thing. And there's another book about another thing about the self that I want you to get through, because I want you to adopt personality traits and skills that are going to help you be successful. So one of those is to show up. One of those is to do a good job. One of those is to show up when conditions are harsh or difficult, because the fewer the people in the room, the greater the chance you're going to develop an individual relationship with somebody in that room. Just makes sense, right? Same as the office romance that happens. So bypassing critical thinking. Did I get my messages across to you? First of all, write this down. Number one, could you see yourself in my shoes? Could you see yourself as a relatively successful writer, somebody who had had a book published, okay, but only had 10,000 copies sold? 10,000 copies at the January 1998 mark was about enough to have earned $10,000 or less in the prior 18 months. Not very much money at all. So could you see yourself in those shoes? Yes. Number two, could you identify with my situation? Not wanting to go to do the event, wanting to cancel. Geez, I don't want to do it. I really should just not do it. Should just skip over it, right? Just skip it. I mean, nobody would blame you for canceling in a foot of snow or more than a foot of snow, right? So could you identify that? Well, you can identify that. You've had lots of times where you've wanted, oh, I don't want to go. It's just ridiculous. And then there's a physical reason that we could argue not to go, right? And then I want you to know that I am going to both succeed and fail as I tell stories. I'm going to succeed in life and I'm going to fail in life. And I was kind of failing because I only had 9 people signed up for the class to begin with, right? So obviously I'm a beginner. I'm very much early in a career here, right? Okay, so if you were thinking of jump starting to a different career, you would know that, hey, 9 people showing up one night would be nothing uncommon. And then you saw success because now you know that Kev did okay after, however, what, 15 years? 15 years later, there's been, a few copies have been sold around the globe in, 41 languages, right? And about 22 books, and all that adds up a little bit. So now you've seen failure and success. Really important to bypass critical thinking, to have both things that happen in a story. And then, did you believe that anything that I did was something that you could also do? Super important. The whole story does no good if you personally, you the listener, do not believe that you couldn't do what I did. Well, hey, what did I do? All I did was go out in the snow. It was a foot of snow. It took me a long time to drive there. And then I taught a class. And then I went out to eat with Mike. And then he offered me a dream position, training at the University of St. Thomas Management Center as adjunct faculty. Absolutely dream position. Could you see yourself having had that result, being on that sort of path where you weren't really all that successful and then you got a door opened? You could see yourself doing that. And then, did you ever, in that presentation of that story, did you hear me talk down at you, sort of like you weren't as important as me? No, not at all, right? We're both on the same playing level. We both have done the same thing here. We're both, sort of early on at whatever it is we're doing, and we both have some success and some failure, right? And then, was there a little bit of self-deprecating humor in this story if the goal of the story was to put smiles on people's faces? Well, in this specific story, there's no humor. But in about 50% of all stories, you'll put self-deprecating humor. We'll talk about that on the next video in the series. And then, do you experience, like if you're identifying with me, some fear or uncertainty about me, my fear of myself, sort of self-fear, fear of what could come next, uncertainty of what could come next? Are you there experiencing that with me? Because boy, I was sure uncertain. As it is, 9 people is a tiny group of people to talk to. 5 is super small and super uncomfortable. And boy, I hope you felt that I was uncomfortable going there. So yeah. And then is the lesson of going ahead and no matter what, you're going to go and do it. You're going to give it 100% tonight, regardless of what the circumstances are. You're going to do that, and you know that. So yes, the lesson is completely transferable. Therefore, this specific story, although certainly by no means the greatest story in the Kevin Hogan arsenal of stories, is a really solid story that can be told over and over and over again, because it's a kernel of how Kevin Hogan ends up going from a very poor Chicago kid to somebody who does pretty well in business, right? Okay, so that's the first video on bypassing critical thought. Watch this again, go through with the notes, check off where each of those things happened, those 8 items happened, with the exception of self-deprecating humor, which we will get to in the next video, which is a little enjoyment in itself. And I will see you, right? Just go do your experiment and come on back, and we'll see you on the next video.